I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today on Just Justice, we have the pleasure of talking with Abe Bonowitz. Abe is one of the nation's most recognized and persistent voices in the movement to end the death penalty. Abe is the co-founder and executive director of Death Penalty Action, a national organization that mobilizes advocacy, education, and direct action to stop executions and end the death penalty. Abe's been involved in a number of successful efforts to end the death penalty in the United States, for instance, in my home state of New Jersey, and in states around the country, including most recently in Delaware. It is no exaggeration to say that Abe has dedicated his life to transforming how America understands justice, accountability, and the value of every human life, regardless of the worst thing they've ever done. Abe, welcome to Just Justice.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful to be with you today. And thanks for that beautiful introduction, too.
Well, thank you for all that you do. And speaking of all that you do, I mean, you've been active in the abolition of the death penalty movement since the late 1980s. But as I understand it, you weren't always against the death penalty. What was the key moment or moments that shifted your view and moved you from supporting the death penalty to being one of the most visible and vocal opponents of capital punishment?
Thank you for asking. Yes, I did not always oppose the death penalty. One of my earliest memories about this was I was probably 12 or 13 watching the news with my dad, and the story was about somebody who'd just been sentenced to death, and then the reporter kicked back to the anchor desk, and that person said, "Well, of course he won't be executed for years." And I remember saying to my dad, "Well, that's wrong. They should take him out and shoot him in the morning," because that was the gut reaction that I had. Um, I don't remember any further dialogue than that. But then later, I was at a meeting of Amnesty International, the human rights organization, which I had heard about, working to free prisoners of conscience, people in prison for their identity anywhere in the world, who had not used or advocated violence. And of course, I was for that. But when the speaker at the very first meeting I went to got up and started talking about the death penalty, I argued with her. I said, an eye for an eye, and this is the United States. We have the best justice system in the world. And if that includes the death penalty, fine, I'll pull the switch myself. And that was my gut reaction, never having experienced violent crime in my own life or my family, not in recent generations anyway. And I set out to try to, well, number one, I wanted to still be a part of that group. I would actually get up at meetings. I'm sure it was quite annoying when I would say, well, I'll work to stop executions in Russia or South Africa, which at that time did have the death penalty. They don't now. But this is the United States, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, I set out to try to prove those people wrong. And in trying to prove them wrong, I found out that everything I believed about the death penalty, the truth was the opposite. I thought it was fair. I thought we always got it right. I thought it was more cost effective to execute than to throw away the key. I thought it was what victim families needed. All these things, turns out I was mistaken, and more. And I had to change my mind. And I like to say that, coming to understand the facts is what changed my mind. Meeting the people on the journey who have been directly impacted by murder and the aftermath of murder is what changed my heart. Coming to understand that we create far more victimization by telling a victim family, wait till we kill the guy and then you'll feel better, but it's going to be a couple of decades. And you have to put your healing process on hold. There's so much more to it than that, but that's the short version. And and then I just found myself getting more and more involved. And, I'm a creative person. My degrees are in photographic technology. When I started, I was working in a graphic arts department. So I had access to sign making stuff and all that. So I just saw a space for myself in the visibility piece of this work and in the organizing piece of this work. And I just kept getting more and more involved. And yeah, at one point I realized that this is, I've got something to contribute. This is what I could do. And I started to figure out how can I earn my living doing this work. And, it's been since 1996 that some one way or another, I've survived by inviting people to help me do this work. And that's how I'm able to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, you co-founded the Death Penalty Action organization, which is a terrific organization for anyone who's interested in learning more. But before we sort of, I want to go. We will talk in a little bit about your experience with folks who've been impacted directly by murder. And their, but before we do that, I just want to stay with your journey for a little bit because I have a particular interest in
Uh-huh.
the New Jersey component because I'm a Jersey girl. And I know that your early work with the New Jerseyans for alternatives to the death penalty helped lead to the repeal of capital punishment in New Jersey in 2007. And I'm just wondering if you could share just a little bit about that experience and maybe how that helps shape the rest of the work that you've done or the continuing work that you've done in other
Sure.
states helping to repeal the death penalty.
Sure. Well, before I started Death Penalty Action, I started a group actually in 1996 and seven called Citizens United for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And that was the first go. It was pretty much a very similar mission to Death Penalty Action. And I worked that. And at some point in the, around 2005, I got a phone call from one of the people that had been, supporting my work and advising me and all that, a criminal defense attorney in New Jersey. And he said, "Hey, do you think you could help us?" So I was hired to do uh, phone canvassing, calling people who were already in their database and just asking them to make their phone calls to their own state legislators, asking them to, thanking them for agreeing to a meeting with people from New Jerseyans for alternatives to the death penalty, and then afterwards calling people to again call and thank them for taking the meeting and just following up on the points of interest. This experience sort of shifted my approach to the work in general. I used to call myself an activist, but that's when I shifted to calling myself more of an organizer. Because an activist, in my view, was out in the streets waving signs, and that's important. But organizing, sometimes you never hear about what an organizer does. You never see that work because it's behind the scenes. And that's kind of what happened in New Jersey. By the time I was brought into the New Jersey campaign, uh, you know, this was not the time for direct action in the streets. We had that first part of my work was getting support for a bill to create a moratorium on executions in New Jersey. There had not been any at that point, but they were being threatened, and create a study task force. And that's what happened. Is there was a New Jersey study task force that was created through this legislation. And once the legislation passed, that's when I was asked to come and become the field manager for New Jerseyans for alternatives to the death penalty. So I actually moved to New Jersey, my wife and my infant and our dog and our cat, actually two dogs at that time. And my job was going around and helping make sure that legislators were hearing from their own constituents. We want to go to organizations and groups that are already meeting, doing their own thing, and just ask them for a little bit of their time. And that's what I did. I spent 2 years going to Bible study groups and churches and synagogues and Quaker meetings, all manner of faith groups that would invite us, as well as the Sierra Club meeting or whatever group would have us, and just asking for 5 or 10 minutes on their agenda and share about what's happening. And for those who are ready, getting them to actually take a piece of paper and a pen and an envelope and a stamp and write a quick note to their own legislator, asking them to support the legislation. But that was kind of the work, and it shaped everything about what I do now. Today, in the atmosphere that we're in today in 2025, there's not a whole lot of opportunity to pass legislation to repeal the death penalty because of the nature of politics right now, plus the fact that we've we've handled it in all the low-hanging fruit states, so to speak. We passed repeal bills well, after we were done in New Jersey, I was hired by the National Coalition to abolish the death penalty, which then existed. I became the director of affiliate support. And as I saw it, my job was to help other state organizations build their capacity to pass such legislation. So I got to be a part of these campaigns in New Mexico and Illinois and Connecticut and Maryland, and to some degree also Nebraska, New Hampshire, Colorado, Virginia, places where we passed these bills. You mentioned Delaware. The courts threw it out in Delaware, New York, and Washington State. But in Washington and Delaware, we also passed legislation to scrub it out of the statute. So there's no longer even any mention of the death penalty in those states. But it's once you're in with the people who can make it happen, that's when you can back off on the big protest actions, and the time is spent more behind the scenes, just making sure that legislators are hearing from their own constituents. And so it's just a balance of what's the need in the moment, and that's what informs what we do, what's the action we take today.
Yeah, and all the states you referenced, it's amazing that the death penalty was effectively abolished there. But they're all blue states, or mostly blue states, maybe with the exception of Nebraska, which I think actually reenacted the death penalty.
Yes, and Virginia as well.
Yeah,
Well,
and
Virginia's blue, especially today. We're recording this right after the election. But
that's right.
yeah, I should mention in Nebraska, which was an all-red state, it's unicameral, so they only have a Senate. And we passed that bill. More Republicans voted to abolish the death penalty than Democrats, because there were only 8 Democrats in that Senate that year. The governor vetoed that bill. The legislature overrode the veto. And then the governor put his own money into a referendum campaign to have the people vote, and it passed, and that put the death penalty back in law, which Nebraska since then, that was in 2016, and they still only had 1 execution so far of a guy who'd been there for more than 40 years. So I was mentioned Nebraska because we did pass the bill, and I knew I'd get the opportunity to follow up to say, thank you very much, that it's been reversed. But that's the only place where that's happened.
Yeah, but where I was going with that is, so you've had a lot of success in primarily blue states with the asterisk next to Nebraska, but we're also seeing today an increase in the use of executions in places like Florida and Texas, and I'm just wondering what you've been doing this work for a long time. What do you think is driving this resurgence in executions? And how does that sort of impact your current strategy about abolition?
Well, first, let me just say that it looks like there's more death penalty. What we are seeing is more executions. We're
Right.
trending low on new death sentences and even capital indictments. And that's because of a strategy that we've been working since about 2007 to drive down the number of new death sentences. And that has worked. And public opinion is at record lows in terms of support for the death penalty. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Yes.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but even though, this is an interesting thing, right? So we're seeing this low imposition of death sentences by capital juries, right? They're not voting for the death penalty, and prosecutors are maybe even reducing the number of cases for which they're
That's
seeking
right.
the death penalty.
That's right.
But we still do have a majority of Americans. It's the lowest I know, like in years and years and years. We still do have a majority of Americans who support capital punishment. And I'm wondering also with, this administration's embrace of the death penalty, how that's going to change also. So as you're sort of thinking
Other-
about my larger question about what is happening, why are we seeing more new executions, and sort of how is that changing what you're doing?
Sure. So you're talking about the president and his agenda. I do want to say that the public opinion, even when you ask the question, yes or no, do you support the death penalty for murder? Even that is still as low as it's been in years. And when you change the question to would you prefer throwing away the key or death by execution, death by incarceration, which is what we really ought to be calling life without parole. It's really death by incarceration, or death by execution. More people prefer the alternative of throwing away the key. And the reason for that, I think, is because people have come to understand that we can't really trust government to get it right all the time. There's a recognition that we've made numerous mistakes and all of that. So it's important for people to recognize that's been a part of the success of our movement, is helping more people understand that. Now, as to this uptick in executions, and you're right, there is an uptick. This year, we're in 2025. By the end of June of this year, we'd had as many executions as we had in all of 2024. That was 25 executions in the year 2024. As we sit here today, recording this on November 5th, there have been 41 executions this year, and we have at least 5 more that are currently scheduled. And we expect even more than that, particularly because of Florida, where Governor DeSantis is keeping 2 to 3 people on death watch, meaning you've got a date and you're segregated and waiting for your execution in the coming weeks. 2 to 3 people at a time. There's currently 2, because they just had an execution last week. By the way, that guy was a veteran, and the next 2 are military veterans. That's a whole other conversation. But basically, the death penalty is being weaponized by some people, by the president. There's this sense that this is what helps me in my primaries. This is what helps me with my base. And actually, I can make the argument that even the MAGA base is uncomfortable with the death penalty. What you have is, and the death penalty has always been an easy tool for policymakers and legislators and governors and candidates for those kinds of offices to say, I'm tougher than this other guy, I'll kill more. And that's what we're seeing with Governor DeSantis. Back before this, before the last presidential election, when it was still in the primaries, Governor DeSantis had not had an execution for several years, part of that because of the pandemic. But then he had like 6 executions. And then he dropped out of the race and the execution stopped. And now we're seeing again this people are teeing up to be the Republican candidate in the next presidential election. And Governor DeSantis is the only one among the possible candidates that we know of at this time who is using the ability he has uniquely in Florida to sign death warrants and to oversee executions. And I say uniquely because in other states, there's other, like in Ohio, the state Supreme Court sets the execution dates. And every state's a little bit different, or it's unique to itself, I should say. So DeSantis is doing this, and he just spoke earlier this week to say that this is for the victim families. And that's a whole conversation that we should have, because it's and anyway, that's what's happening there. We did have 2 executive orders. One signed immediately upon within an hour of President Trump taking office. He signed his first executive order on the death penalty, which basically called for a number of things to happen, including for the Department of Justice to support states wanting to have executions and getting the drugs they need for lethal injections or whatever else they wanted to do. He also called for, President Biden had commuted 37 of the 40 people on the federal death row. We had campaigned for him to commute all 40 of them, plus the 4 that are on the military death row. He stopped short of that. He did 37 of the 40. And President Trump ordered in his executive order that those people be held in the most restrictive, punishing situation possible. And also, they sent some of those people back to the states where they were convicted of to see if they can be tried and convicted again in state court and maybe sentenced to death there. And that attempt is happening in Louisiana and in South Carolina that I know of off the top of my head. And who knows where that's going to go. But, unless one of the people currently on federal or military death row waives their appeals and says, go ahead and kill me, it's unlikely that Donald Trump will be able to have a judicial execution on his watch before his term ends. So anyway, that's kind of what we're seeing. It's as if there's this red state cabal of attorney generals and governors saying, we're gonna execute more. Um, but really, what's happening, Jessica, is that they're clearing out, you know, people that are being executed. We've executed 2 people this year who've been on death row nearly 50 years.
Yeah,
These are
yeah,
people
we
who've
have.
been there forever. And that's the other thing that very strategically Governor DeSantis is doing is the people that his advisors are picking for him to sign death warrants for are people for whom, like this last guy, the state had to ask the court to appoint an attorney for him because he was unrepresented. The prosecutor said, we need to make sure this guy has an attorney so that we can move through the process and make it appear that he's represented. I mean, it's just bizarre in that way, but they're picking the people that they can easily move without a big fight. And they are executing people that where there's, you know, victim families oppose it, where there's legitimate reasons to show mercy because of how they came to be in a place where they would carry out where they would conduct the murders that they did. We're executing people where the victims are adamant that they don't want the execution.
Well, let's talk about that. So, you've mentioned a couple of times how one of the reasons you came to realize that your position in favor of capital punishment was perhaps misguided, was wrong, is because you realized that families who have survived, who have, I'm sorry, because you realized that people who have family members who were murdered didn't necessarily want the death penalty or were not finding comfort and healing from capital punishment. And I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about your experience. Maybe there's a story or a person who comes to mind when you think about what it is that you're finding in your work that victims say they want and need.
Um, we could do a whole podcast just about this, but there's
Mhm.
2 things I want to talk about with this. One is the policy of the death penalty as a balm for the wounds of victim families, but also what is it? What is the reality of it? So when I got involved in this work, I very soon met people who are victim family members who reject the death penalty. At that time, there was a group called Murder Victim Families for Reconciliation, which was specifically that victim family members that were outspoken against the death penalty, and some of whom even helped the person who killed their loved one reverse their death sentence or not get death. Okay. And that organization even had they published a report called Dignity Denied at one point, which actually chronicled a number of cases where because they were outspoken against the death penalty, but the prosecutor wanted it, that their victim services dried up. And they
Mm.
actually became bad victims, and they no longer had somebody sitting in court with them from the government to help hold their hand and get them coffee and make sure they had the information that was coming on. So, yeah, that's one of the problems with the death penalty is when they say it's for victim families, and then we use it in this tiny percentage of cases. But again, what happens? It's actually a blessing in disguise when they don't get a death sentence in the case of the person who killed your loved one, because there's there's never closure. There's always that empty chair at the table when the family gathers. No amount of killing will bring back our loved ones. But if I have to wait decades for the finality in the case, then uh, then I'm putting my healing process on hold. Plus, we're watching this appeals process happen, and our most recently become emeritus board chair, Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother and 2 cousins were among those killed in the Charleston church shooting that has Dylan Roof being on the federal death row. What she talks about is, every time there's an appeal, every time it's in the news, it takes her back to the day she got that phone call that her mother had been murdered. The pain returns, and it makes healing hard, and it keeps bringing.
But Abe, I think one thing people would say then is, well, let's shorten the appeals process, right? I mean, we know that the average length of an appeal is like 13, 14 years. And you were just talking about someone who was on death row for like 40 years. So I think one thing that people often say is, well, it shouldn't take that long. Let's just, once they've been found guilty and have, sort of a typical appeal, we should execute them so that we can allow people to heal. How do you respond to people who say that?
we are the United States. We purport to have a constitution. We live by the rule of law, theoretically, some of us, and therefore we have to follow the process. We have to remember that appeals are not about guilt or innocence. They're about, did we follow the letter of the law? Are all the T's crossed? Were all the I's dotted? And even though the courts have of late been rejecting the whole idea that you get to bring certain things up at certain, at some point there's a cutoff, and that's one of the reasons why we're having a lot of executions, is because things that would have been heard in court 10 years ago are now being routinely procedurally barred, and we're not getting through there. So to the victim issue, the victim family issue, it's a restriction of healing, a delay in a healing process being able to begin when we say wait until we kill the guy. From a public policy point of view, and that's where I'm not myself in recent generations a murder victim family member, and so I don't know that experience. But when they say that the death penalty is for victim families, and that they use it so infrequently. I mean, how many murders do we have every year? And still we're talking about executions in the dozens, and the low dozens, not thousands, not hundreds, not nearly fast enough. What are we actually saying to the vast majority of victim families? Your loved one wasn't valuable enough. And we're saying that to 98% of the victim families where the death penalty is even possible. Now, let me back up and give you some hard numbers on that, because what do I mean when I say that? Of all the murders that take place, where they catch someone, which is only about half the time, where they're death eligible, which is a much smaller subset of the people who commit murder who are caught. So of the death eligible people, they don't always seek a death sentence. When they do, they don't always get one. When they do get a death sentence, it doesn't always stick to the point of execution. And I'll give you the New Jersey numbers on this. New Jersey's death penalty was, I think, written in 1982 or 81, somewhere in there. And we had these numbers up until 2004 that we were using in our campaign in 2005 and 6. Basically, of all the murders that had happened in New Jersey in those decades, there were about 630 that were punishable by death, death eligible. Not all of them, just 630. Of those 630, they only tried for the death penalty in 230 of them. So right away, cut it more than in half. And then of those 230, they got a conviction and a death sentence in 60 of them. So now you're at 10%. And by the time we abolished the death penalty and Governor Corzine signed that law, at that time he commuted the sentences of the remaining people on death row, which was 8 out of 630 potentially death eligible cases. And were these the worst of the worst? In most cases, no. But it boils down to fewer than 2% of the people who commit murder who are caught, who could have been executed or get a death sentence, actually getting a death sentence and staying on death row to the point of the death penalty being abolished in New Jersey. But this plays out pretty much across the country with these kinds of numbers. And the question has to be asked, what are we doing for all the rest of the victim family members if the death penalty is what we've got, but we use it so infrequently? And they can't answer that question. And that's a whole other dialogue. But I'll share with you very quickly that in Ohio, we had a study commission also. And one of the recommendations of that study commission was study the need of victim families, and actually legislated that and appointed the joint committee of the legislature, which didn't do anything to study the issue. But I went and tried to get them to do something. We actually took a proposal to them and said, here's the Kirwan Institute on Race and Ethnic Studies at Ohio State University will actually study this. You just need to come up with some money to pay the graduate students, and they wouldn't do that. So then I went to the Ohio Victim Witness Association, which does trainings for victim responders, for first, people that help victim families. And they said, oh, we'll do that study. And they got the money and they did do the study. And the death penalty is not on the list of things that victim families need, that came out of either our own checking in with victim families or what they did. Victim families need services like help burying a loved one, like counseling, like if you've lost a wage earner to murder, help paying the bills. I mean, there's a whole list of things. And just as with police chiefs, the last thing on the list is maybe an execution. Police chiefs also reject the idea of death penalty as something to help prevent crime. So, as a
So
public
Abe,
policy, it fails us too.
yeah, and staying with the healing idea though for a minute. So you sort of broke this down, and you're right from a policy point of view. Even where the death penalty is an eligible thing, it's so costly for counties to seek the death penalty that they're often not doing it anymore. And you're right. There's this whole sort of hierarchy about how and which murders prosecutors deem eligible for capital cases. But back to the idea of victims' families and their healing processes. Obviously, victims are not a monolith, and there are some who say that the death penalty heals them, is healing when someone is executed. But there's also sort of, I think, your answer, which is, well, we have life without parole, which is also called death in prison. And that's often put forward as the humane alternative to the death penalty. It serves the same retributive function. Someone's going to die in prison. People even make the argument that perhaps it's worse to be sentenced to life without parole than death. And I'm just wondering what's your position on life without parole as that alternative punishment, as that punishment for folks who commit murder? Do you support that sentence, or what's your take on it?
Well, I will tell you that life without parole is a cruel punishment also. It is the alternative that exists these days. So I can think whatever I think about it. It is what it is. And especially when you're trying to move a policymaker to help them understand that they can vote against the death penalty and those people will still be held accountable and society protected from them, then, you know, that's the easy answer. And I will actually tell you that I don't remember the legislator's name, but I remember in particular one who represented New Jersey District 1. Kirk Bloodsworth had gone to see him.
Hmm.
Kirk Bloodsworth was the first person exonerated from death row using DNA technology. And he was convicted, sentenced to death. Sentence was overturned. Then he was resentenced. He was convicted again and sentenced to, actually, his conviction was overturned. He was convicted and sentenced again and sentenced to life without parole. And then later, when he figured out about DNA and got the DNA testing, and that's a whole story, a whole book of his own. It's called Bloodsworth, and you can read it. But he basically, in his book, shared how life in prison is a horrible thing in and of itself.
Hmm.
And this legislator in District 1, which is all the way down in Cape May, his son had been killed by a drunk driver, which obviously
Hmm.
wasn't a capital offense, but he had this penchant for punishment. He was very pro punishment, very, pro police, which doesn't equate, but that's the kind of legislator he was. And when when I was part of a meeting with him, after he had met with Kirk, and he had on his desk Kirk's book. And he told
Mm,
us he had read this book and now he understood that life without parole is worse. And that's what he wanted. And therefore, he would vote to abolish the death penalty.
mm,
And now I'll take that vote because first step is get rid of the death penalty. I do think that prisons are not supposed, should not be torture. They should not be punitive. We do deserve to be safe from people who are still dangerous, and we get to hold people accountable. But I don't think we need to throw away the key, and we're actually doing ourselves a disservice in some cases by deciding to do that. And I'll just give you two examples. There's a guy named Rudy Alexander. He was 17 when he committed a murder in Georgia. He was on death row for that murder. He admits that he did it. And then in 1972, the US Supreme Court struck down all the death penalty laws, and that changed everybody's sentence to life, whatever the next maximum punishment was. And at that time, a life sentence might mean 10 or 15 years before you could be considered for parole. Well, Rudy Alexander pulled himself up, got himself out, and he, I don't even know if he's still alive, but he retired after many years as a fully tenured professor of criminology at Ohio State University. It's the
Mm.
guy who committed murder, should have been executed and could have been executed, but instead had the opportunity for a reset. That's not going to be all murderers, but the possibility for redemption is real and should be something that we consider in these cases. Obviously, there are some people, as they presently exist, should never be free, and some people who commit horrific crimes so much that they should never be free. But I don't think it should be in every case because there is a possibility for redemption. And so for me, the other thing I want to say is that, again, if your motivation is punishment and the cruelty of imprisonment, then I'll just share with you there was a man whose his wife reached out to us a few months ago and asked us to help advocate for him to actually just have his cancer treated. He had some kind of cancer that made these growths on his bones. It actually broke his elbow, and they were refusing to give him the surgery to fix that, and he was just shrieking in the clinic in Florida State Prison in pain. And he's at stage 4 cancer, and he's getting Tylenol for his pain. Now, if you ever know anybody that's in that kind of severe pain, my aunt had breast cancer, and when it came back after she treated it the first time, she decided she was just going to go, and she had a button she could push in hospice that would give her more morphine, right? That's not what we give to prisoners. Dying in prison, being sick in prison is that much worse than just being in prison. But even if you're perfectly healthy, you're never going to be able to, or you got a hankering for a pizza, you want Chinese food tonight, forget it. You want to make love to your partner of choice, forget it. You want to walk barefoot on grass, forget it. You want to go swimming, never again. Life in prison is severe punishment. And what I try to do is help people understand that so they can recognize we don't need the death penalty to hold people accountable, to punish them severely, and to be safe from them.
Yeah, and I think I may be coming at this a little bit differently than you. I mean, I'm an abolitionist. I've been against the death penalty forever and ever and ever. I just have never, it's never made sense to me. And in my own research and my own thinking about punishment, life without parole, I trip over that as well because Just Justice is a show that's all about redemption. It's about second chances. It's about transformation and that possibility. And when I think I like to advocate against the death penalty, but I also sort of in that same breath like to say that I don't even think that we need life without parole as that backup, as that alternative, although maybe that's what makes it palatable. Um, because I don't know that we need to keep people in prison forever without allowing for that possibility of change and transformation.
I
And so
agree with
it's interesting to hear. I from an advocacy point of view, I can understand how life without parole is that sort of alternative that you can present. But as somebody who um, isn't sort of advocating just against the death penalty, I'm always struck by life without parole because it's not just it's cruel because it eliminates the possibility of hope.
well,
Um,
actually, I would say that there are people who have, come to understand I'm never getting out, and they figure out how to have some value in their life. But I agree with you. I mean, I personally, I'm not a big advocate of life without parole. I recognize
mhm,
it exists, but when I say these things in the way that I say them, I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking to the
mhm,
people that want executions, and I'm
mhm,
trying to get them to give it a different way of thinking so that we can understand. Because most of the people that want executions also don't trust government to tax us fairly or to fill potholes well or to come up with a proper virus vaccine for the in the next pandemic. So if you can't trust government for these things, how are you trusting them with the power to kill? And giving them, planting the seed with them so they can begin to think over time, wait a minute, you're right. That guy deserves whatever gets coming, but I can't trust government to get it right.
mm,
And it's all about how do I change the minds of the people that can move on this issue, and therefore we can abolish the death penalty and take that out of the hands of government.
mhm, mhm. Let me ask you, what are some of the current controversies happening in capital punishment right now? Right, we're seeing this uptick in executions, but beyond that, there's a lot of things happening. about methods of executions, for instance. Do you want to just spend a minute sort of telling people what's happening on the ground?
As to the current controversies of the day, it's really about, yes, the manner of executions. And I will say for myself in death penalty action, we don't take a position on how we kill our prisoners. It's that we kill them when the system is as broken as it is, of all the other things. But we're talking about, you know, drug companies don't want their legitimately therapeutic drugs used for executions, and they've restricted their use.
Hmm.
That's made some states having a difficult time to get the drugs they need, so they can't carry out executions. So they're looking at alternative methods. In South Carolina, we're going to execute a guy at the end of, let's see, on November 14th. Last Friday he had to choose between electrocution, lethal injection, or firing squad.
So I need to pause for a second. It's an extraordinary thing that in some states they're actually saying to people, choose the way you want to die next week.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, it's just
Right.
a question I can't imagine ever being presented with.
And they didn't give that choice to their victim, did they? Right? You want to choose how I'm going to kill you. Yeah, it's part of the cruelty and it's part of the torture. And the truth is that actually the real torture of the death penalty is in the wait and everything that goes on. And you know, we had to pause starting today's recording because just this morning in Oklahoma, the Board of Pardons and Paroles uh, um, granted a recommendation for clemency for a guy named Tremaine Wood, who is scheduled to be executed on November 13th. He is a law of parties case. In other words, his brother admitted to actually killing the guy, and he was present. So that's what law of parties is, or felony murder. You're present to a crime, but you're not actually the person that committed that pulled the trigger. And yet he's the actual killer got life by a different jury. Tremaine got death. And today there is this recommendation for clemency, which now goes to the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Stitt, who has yet to he's granted only one clemency, and that wasn't
Hmm.
because of guilt or innocence. And that's a whole other conversation, but that's Julius
Hmm.
Jones. You can look up that case.
Hmm.
But now there's this torture for the next 9 days, or whatever it is, 8 days, until Tremaine Wood's execution day. We're all going to be going to the governor and asking him to commute the sentence, and he's in all likelihood not going to do so. That's the
So,
torture also.
yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, you're right. So the man that's going to be killed that had this choice in Stephen Bryant is his name in South Carolina. I think he made the same choice that I would, which is to die by firing squad. If I'm given a choice of lethal injection, electrocution, or firing squad, I know that if they shoot straight, then I'm going to be unconscious immediately.